Welcome to today's Counterfeit Component panel discussion. Counterfeit component people have been getting a lot more sophisticated in disguising their methods to avoid detection. How can manufacturers combat this growing menace, and where does the liability lie? Is it with the originator, is it with the distributor, or is it with the assembler? To discuss this, I have a very distinguished panel. From the extreme left, we have Keith Bryant from Exelon. To his right, we have Don Jecka from ScienceScope, and to my immediate left, we have Michael Ford from Aegis. Welcome, gentlemen. Okay. So, if I can go straight in with my first question, it's going to be, give us some examples of recent counterfeit that you have come across.
I think we brought a couple of pictures along with us to have a look at of some examples that we've seen for different companies that have participated in the IPC traceability. I think what the slide here is showing that, we have integrated circuits where the surface has been wiped clean and some other printing has been done on top. And, you can detect that this has happened. And odds on, this new marking is not the original marking of the component. Right. So you've basically got a cheaper component marked up as being something more expensive. So this is something typical of the kind of things that have been seen. I have another picture then where we start to see the result of defects that are being collected. So one batch of components may be fine and the next one starts to be showing a large rate of defect. Not a perfect 100% defect, but some of them are defects.
Right.
So if we have a look at the next picture, here we see that some components have, for example, markings on them which do not look genuine. Here the white component is having the true image of the Fairchild, but the one on the top is just an F. Somebody's put an F there and expecting people to believe that it's true.
It's true.
On the next slide, I think we have a picture of the X-ray of these, and these are kind of typical pictures that your equipment would pick up.
Yeah. The inside of a counterfeit generally looks completely different. The die is different, the lead outs on the wire bonds are different, and in some cases they even cut legs to actually make the thing look like they want it to. So yeah, X-ray is for this kind of, let's say for this, I'm going to call it a basic level of counterfeiting.
Right.
X-ray is a great tool for finding this out, because the inside generally always looks completely different.
Completely different, yeah.
That's correct. Very consistent with what we've seen. And basically you can set up a program that'll just look at the wire bonds and identify them that way.
Yeah. I mean, the scariest thing I saw was, in my time as a consultant, was the beginning of last year. A mil-spec company called me in because they suddenly started to get a huge quantity of failures at environmental testing and HAS test and this kind of thing, that they weren't seeing before. Basically, the components were the same. You know that basically military spec guys use sorted components. So the component manufacturer takes 2,000 components, he puts them through a really harsh test regime, 200 of them end up at the end, and they become military spec components.
Right.
So they're basically the standard component plus. So they sell for a bucket load more money, and they sell with the CFC and all the other stuff that goes with it. And the unit cost is really high because of the testing, because of the dropout and everything else.
Right.
And as I say, suddenly these components that should have withstood everything are starting to fail, and it was 5 or 6 different components, and it was literally 60-70% of what was going through test.
Really?
And eventually we traced it back to a very, very simple counterfeit. They left the components the same, but they counterfeited the mil-spec paperwork. And
wow.
You say, well, because obviously when I fly home on Thursday evening, I'm going to be in an aeroplane, and most of the technology that's in there is going to be, we hope, military spec components.
Military spec components.
And these guys lost a lot of money. They lost about, before they fixed the problem, they probably lost about 1 month's production. And it was hugely expensive for them. And they sort of said, okay, so what can we do? And to be honest, there was only one solution.
Right.
They do all the testing themselves.
Yep.
So they have set up a huge component test lab, and they're effectively buying the standard components, putting them through all the tests, and then knowing that the ones that they have left are what they're supposed to be.
Right.
But for me, that's the scariest new counterfeit that I've seen.
Right. And that's just adding even more cost, really, I guess, in some ways. But they are getting a lot more sophisticated, Don, about the methods of counterfeiting. You're getting things like every 8th component on a reel is counterfeit and this type of thing. Or what can we do to get ahead of this?
So it's an interesting question because it's always going to exist, right? And so if you look at chain of command, who actually, chain of custody, who has that component from the time it's manufactured to the time it reaches, assembly, being placed on a circuit board. It's how do you put pressure on the people that are in that chain to make sure that that component's real? And I look at it and say that's about the only way that we can fully go after this problem is to do it by ownership. Who has ownership of that component?
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, and it really brings into my second question, which is where does the responsibility lie? Does it lie with the originator, or with the distributor, or with the assembler? I would have thought probably with the distributor in some respects. I mean, these big companies like Arrow and DigiKey, who are buying many thousands of components and have got deeper pockets to be able to do the testing, should be able to give guaranteed product.
Well, there was one case that we saw where a finished product had a problem. They traced it back to a counterfeit. Now, for the manufacturer, and it depends on the case-by-case legal arrangement that people have made as to who's going to be responsible and who's going to pay for it, but the manufacturer then has to prove that they were not negligent in terms of using that counterfeit material. So if they knew it was counterfeit and they still used it, they're responsible.
Right.
So how do they prove that they didn't do that? And this is where traceability comes in. So if you're able to show that all of the necessary procedures were followed and you can know exactly where the materials were used, should that counterfeit happen, you can then trace it back to a source. Now, tracing it back to a source means that somehow maybe you'll argue with the lawyers and try and say, well, look, we did everything possible. It wasn't our fault. Now we want to go after the supplier or whoever gave us that component, and maybe they are liable. So it becomes an exercise where lawyers make a lot of money. Manufacturers, unfortunately, have a lot of risk and a lot of burden of having to do things.
Right.
What we would prefer to see from the traceability side is that it gets to a level where it becomes reliable enough to pinpoint where that counterfeit entered the supply chain. Because when you can do that, and the counterfeiters know that they are going to be found out and prosecuted, and we have seen prosecutions here in the US many times in the last year where this has happened.
Right.
As soon as they realize they're not going to get away with it, guess what? They're not going to do it anymore. And that is where we need to get to, because otherwise, what we've been talking about with all of this testing, that cost goes into the product that we make.
Right. But is most of the counterfeiting coming from homegrown from the US, or is it really coming from Asia?
It's coming wherever the materials are coming from.
Right.
And so.
And if it's coming from Asia, how easy is it to prosecute?
It depends what the counterfeit is, because sometimes the counterfeit is a case where a company's gone out and obviously made something that's not real. But then your case, where they simply did the paperwork to make something look like something else, that can happen locally.
Right. Yeah, and they also repurpose old components, which have got the same value, but they're just older components.
Yeah, I mean, I applaud the fact that the US are actually starting to prosecute people. In Europe, we're way behind, and in Asia, there's, how can I tactfully put this, there's no interest in doing it.
Right.
And that's where the volume stuff's happening, and that's where the worst lawbreakers or rule breakers, whatever you'd like to call them, are from.
Right.
And really that's that's what I would like to see happen. The traceability thing is absolutely brilliant because you can find the culprit.
Yeah.
But now you have to do something to that culprit. That means there's no longer an interest in them carrying on doing it.
But doesn't it really drive things towards the big distributors again? I mean, because they're buying in such huge bulk that if they detect somebody providing counterfeit product, they cut them off as a supplier. and they lose a lot of revenue. So that would be the obvious deterrent.
Oh yeah, but most of the value to counterfeiters is, as you saw in the first slides, it's taking a cheap component and remarking it as a component that's expensive. Now that component is expensive probably because it's on a 10-month, 12-month lead time. Nobody can afford to wait that long, so they have to go to the grey market to buy it.
Yeah.
And these guys don't want to sell 50-cent components. They want to sell stuff, $10 and up. Mm-hmm. So that's generally stuff which is driven by component shortages, obsolescence, and this kind of thing. And that's really the hard thing to go after, because you buy these things on the grey market like you shop on the internet now almost.
Yeah. So
the big distributors, occasionally stuff is going to get into their chain because they possibly buy it on the grey market. Mm-hmm. But that's where the law needs to be going next, is going to these guys who are supplying the stuff, and that's the tough one.
Right. Dan, what do you think we can do to take effective steps to try and reduce this?
So I mentioned earlier about just chain of custody. Excuse me. I actually believe that some of it has to be that there's commitment, a legal document commitment, saying that this is in fact, I'm selling this to you, it is in fact what I say it is. Then that hands on to the distributor. The distributor has to do the same thing, is that I certify that this is in fact correct. And I really believe that the onus has to be put on each person that is touching that component in the chain.
Right.
So, and legal remedies obviously very difficult in Asia, which is the root of the problem, right, to be factual. But at the same time, if those commitments have behind them the kind of teeth, like we will never do business with you again, and we will report you to Interpol or whatever those other steps are, I believe that's the way to go after it.
Michael, I mean, there's been various talk over the years of trying to introduce maybe some sort of dye or digital footprint into the devices themselves to try and prove their authenticity. Are we getting any further along in that kind of route?
It's being talked about a fair bit. The kind of concept is where you have marking on packages, bonded packages, or even on devices themselves. At the basic level, it would be something like a QR code, so that it goes to a secure website, and you can then establish a link between the original supplier information for the material and what you have in your hand. So if the same QR code is read in two different places, then you know it's been copied. But you go to the next level, and you can create truly unique marking. So this is using analysis of fibers. There's some technology for that, but there are a lot of different technologies now which can be used to create this unique code, and then you can't copy that code.
Right.
And so therefore you know that for every code there is a packet of materials, and that establishes the supply chain of trust, if you like, from the supplying materials to the point of use. It's still an idea at the moment, because this is not just a US problem, this is worldwide.
Yeah.
And you think about all of the people that produce materials, it's going to be a bit of a problem. But it is being talked about in various different areas.
It would really have to come in it would have to come in, though, as a standard or something that everybody worked to, so that it was universally adopted.
Absolutely, that is the way to approach it, and so we're exploring how to do that.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Well, guys, it's an ongoing debate. There's always going to be another trick around the corner that we haven't thought of yet. Has anybody got any other input onto how we could avoid this problem before we finish?
I'd love to have the golden bullet answer to that question, Trevor. I think we'd all become very rich if we could do it. But you're exactly right. The counterfeiters become cleverer, the detection becomes cleverer, the counterfeiters become cleverer. From my side, I would like governments to become more involved, because in reality it's not an electronics problem.
Right.
There are planes crashing, helicopters crashing because component parts have been fabricated cheaply from the wrong materials and sold as OEM parts and all of this kind of stuff. So, counterfeiting is a huge subject. Yeah. And, electronics for us is the most important part. But, as far as governments are concerned, there needs to be more legislation, and there needs to be a stronger punishment for the people who are caught doing it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's one thing I would say about the legislation in the US versus Europe. You know, Europe might pass the same legislation, but they don't enforce it, which is the problem. So, yeah.
For me, just as a final word, IPC 1782 traceability standard is a great deterrent against counterfeit, because at least then you have all of the information to find the next responsible party in the chain. That's insurance.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Great comment. Great debate, guys. Thank you very much for joining us. Keith Bryant from Exelon, and Dan Jenka from ScienceScope, and Michael Ford from Aegis. Thank you for joining us.